like, I'm not gonna lie. Ooh, and this lecture is brought to you from my new computer! So it should actually be able to render and stream at the same time. Very exciting. Yeah, I've never built a computer before, and it turns out my first motherboard was bad, so I had to return that. Anyway, that was fun. And then I'm like, I want this done, so I had to, like, rage go out and, like, curbside a motherboard from Best Buy. It was super fun. Anyway, also fun tidbit about this computer is it is running an integrated graphics card and no other graphics card because it's better than my old one. So how do you like them apples? Anyway, yeah. My old computer was, like, really old. Alright, so this is the terrifying file that why is this straight up not showing up? Later problems. Basically, I just want to show you guys how to do some of this stuff. I want to go over some of the clear glass things, with the exception, I think, of maybe, like, if there's lights on, like, the hot glue gun and the top of the pressure pot lid, probably not super useful, but I want you guys to be aware of how you would do this stuff for the final, because it might affect how you want to model your stuff. So I'll go over some glass stuff, I'll go over a little bit more texturing stuff, show you guys how to make fun neon signs, because who doesn't love a fun neon sign, and displacement maps, and that is actually pretty much all the things. So, let's start with this random glass on the table. Alright. Actually, this kind of looks better than what I was doing this morning. So anyway, what I've done, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hide I'm going to hide this water. The annoying thing about Arnold textures is when you make where am I going with this? Glass object, it just doesn't show up in the viewport unless you click it, which is annoying. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and start from scratch. I'm just going to assign this a new material. And if you guys are having issues with lag or anything, let me know. I'm trying to figure out what my computer can do and what my computer can't do at this point. Alright, so we have this basic AI standard surface. And I'm going to go ahead... Actually, one thing I do really quickly want to note about this is I have modeled, like, the thicker part in the bottom of this glass. So if you're doing stuff like glasses, pay attention to how they're actually made and the thickness of the glass, because that will dramatically affect how realistic your glass looks in the end. Anywho. Also, Alt-Z will undo your last camera move, so that's a fun little thing. Alright. So pretty much the same thing that I did for previously. So if I wanted to make this glass, I'm just going to go ahead and turn transmission all the way up. And then there's a few other settings that you might want to play with. So I think before I mentioned tint if you want a horrendously green-looking glass, which is just, like, frankly terrifying and awful, so I'm going to set that back to white. There's some other stuff, like, honestly, I haven't found depth, scatter, or scanner anisotropy to be particularly useful for anything that you guys are going to be doing in this class. So I'm not really going to go over it, because I think, like I said, I think pretty much anything you guys will be making for this class is either just, like, a flat glass screen on something, or just, like, a flat piece of glass, or, like, a little LED light, in which case, you don't really need to worry too much about those. So this dispersion, ABBE, whatever this is, no idea how you pronounce it. Basically what this does is, you can kind of see it, particularly in the unfinished renders, where you get a lot of that little reflections, sort of like colorful reflections that'll come through, particularly in thicker glass is where this is usually really apparent. It usually does add some time to the render. I think it's fun, so I will oftentimes turn it on, but that's what that is. It's just adding that little bit of, like, extra sort of reflection to things. And sometimes, depending on your model and your lighting, sometimes it'll show up, sometimes it won't. So it really just kind of depends, again, on what you're doing. I'm going to turn this off. There's also a setting for extra roughness, so if you wanted to make frosted glass, you could do it here. This is going to look really bad once it finishes rendering, just because of how far I put that slider up, or usually, honestly, I'll just use the roughness of Specular. I feel like they look pretty much the same, and this one seems to render faster. You can also go ahead, like if you make that totally clear, which is incredibly unrealistic, or totally unrough, you can get very clear glass, or you can just add a little teeny bit of roughness, and that'll make it not frosted, but like just more realistic. But anywho. So those are most of the settings that I'll use for glass things. The other setting that I wanted to talk about, which I mentioned briefly last time, is this IOR, this index of refraction. So this basically is how when light goes into this glass, like how is it bouncing around and how is it wrapping and how is it distorting before coming back out. So it's really obvious, particularly on like the thicker areas of glass and like anywhere that there's warping, which is why I added the sort of little weird extrudes on the side. So there's a few different approaches you can take for this. If you're just going for something that's sort of like a random, just like a random piece that you just want to kind of look cool, it doesn't need to be super realistic, you can just pick a random slider value for this, just something you like. You do some really, really strange stuff if you invert this, kind of makes a fake chrome look. There's also, if you're so inclined, if you Google IOR of glass, or numerous other objects, it will give you the specific, actual, real-world values for index of refraction, which is super fun, because since Arnold is a physically based renderer, this is actually pretty much already there. If you plug in that value, it will give you something that's pretty close to real-world looking glass. The caveat to that is, if you've not made your stuff to scale, your glass is not going to look to scale. Which, incidentally, is like kind of what's happening here, because this glass is like 20 millimeters tall. So in this case, like, I'd probably just kind of ignore that and just pick something I thought looked cool. But again, do be aware that, like, if you are looking to specifically recreate something, there's like a lot of different websites that'll just tell you index of refractions for a bunch of different random things. So if you ever need stuff like this, like, it's available, and you can probably find the information, somewhere. Oh, cool. Nice. Anyway, but yeah. So that's the thing. Any questions on that so far? Alright, cool. Alright, so if you wanted to add some kind of fluid into your glass, it's pretty much exactly the same process, honestly. I just tinted this a little bit, and I could set the index of refraction to be the actual value for real-world water, which is 1.33 based on that internet thingy. And then it'll give you something, again, that looks kind of real-worldy in terms of the glass. The tints are kind of weird, because, like, you can see, I mean, this is, like, bright orange, but it's depending on, like, which direction you look at it, and because it's so thick, it'll usually end up a little bit darker than what you originally planned, so just be aware of that. The other thing that you should be aware of for glass is specifically, like, if you're watching sort of, like, the edge up here, so basically what I did is I duplicated the outer shell of this glass, and then I just deleted some faces and closed them off. So this is basically a direct, perfect representation of the inside of this glass. What I did, though, is I scaled it up a tiny bit by 0.004, apparently. So if I unscale this, just put that back to... not 0. Hello. That looks good. If I put this back to 1, that would actually be perfectly lined up with the inside of the glass. Yeah. And you can see it's changed a little bit of, like, how the glass is sort of reflecting. So honestly, I'll just sort of do something that looks nice. For now, there's a bunch of different resources online that'll, like, give you different examples of, like, you know, how, depending on, like, how you set up your mesh, like, how it'll end up looking in the glass. But this is just, like, again, just be aware that, like, depending on how much this ends up clipping through stuff, it will look different in your final render. Obviously, if you do something really stupid like that, and just have your, like, a floating chunk of fluid in here, that's a whole different thing. But, anywho. So like I said, I don't think any of you guys will be needing to do this, so I'm not really going to go over it super crazy much. But if you are interested, like, and you actually just do IOR glass, Google Images will also pull up a lot of different stuff trying to, like, illustrate this exact same point. So just a weird sort of thing. This one's also nice because it shows you how stuff is shining through the glass. But yeah, so that's more or less like water glasses. Any questions on that before I pop into some other random things? Alright, cool. And actually, for fun, because I'm a crazy person, I feel like it would be fun to make some kind of like disgusting toxic fluid, so here we have disgusting toxic fluid. Anyway, we continue. Okay, so eyeballs. We go from toxic fluid to eyeballs. Oh god, it is. Oh, wait, no. Okay. Now I have to make. I've committed. Now I have to commit to Mountain Dew. I actually don't know what color Mountain Dew is, so I'm just going to assume brighter green and a little bit more like the yellow side, and also more brighter green. Does that feel Mountain Dewy enough? Maybe? Okay. I don't know. I don't know what this is. It kind of looks like Jello to me. Excellent. Okay, so eyeballs. I'm going to start with eyeballs. Basically, I did the exact same thing where this is, the outer texture of this is basically just glass. The reason that I actually include the outer texture at all, you can see it changes, so I hit it really quick. You can see it changes the kind of the look of the eye, whereas if I re-enable that and show it again, it just gives a little bit more depth and dimension, and the kind of cool thing about it is, that's a floor. Depending, like, particularly if you're looking at this from the side, it's going to give you a little bit of, like, that weird distortion that, like, actual eyeballs have, which is kind of nice. And there's a lot of diagrams on eyes online, which is completely irrelevant to this class, so I'm not really going to go into it super a lot. But again, you can do different stuff. So this is actually kind of something similar to if you wanted to have glass on like a screen for, you know, a Switch or something like that, where you wanted like a piece of glass over a phone screen. This is how you would do it a lot of times, except instead of having a piece of glass with like geometry nested in it, you would basically just have a piece of glass in front of another piece of geometry. And then, you know, it'll give you a little bit more of that like sort of 3D kind of look to your stuff. So that's actually mostly why I wanted to show the eye. It's weirdly similar to doing like screens. Does anybody have any? That was pretty much it for my glass stuff. Does anybody have any questions about that before we pop into some weird shader hacks?
So I am on like a Switch, and I thought that this is what I would have to do for the screen. But then I tried it, and it's kind of weird because you want us to do a smooth model. Like, how would I match the roundness of the edges from the screen and the rest and like the hole in the Switch?
Gotcha. So I mean, that would be mostly, let me just set up a really, really janky screen. Alright. So, I did the bad thing where I did an extrude without moving the extrude. Note the extra flat edge loops here. Yay. To fix that, I'm just gonna go and do an edit mesh, merge, and there we go. Cool. Alright, so I'm just gonna scale these out. I'm just kind of like, hello, whatever. I would ignore the fact that I just made horrible geometry in this. Alright, so you're saying basically how would you match if you had something like this, this hole that you had to fill with geometry. Dang it. Very poorly modeled hole. Alright, so if you had something like this, you need to like basically fill a matching hole in here. So one thing that you could do is, that's actually, hang on. Oop. Okay, I don't know, oh, right, because I duplicated it, sorry, I'm going crazy. Okay, so one thing you could do is just duplicate this object and delete all the outside faces on it. And this is like probably, this is probably the easiest way to get the same sort of shape that you had on the outside. It's a little bit overkill, but this is also more or less how I made the inside of this glass. It also seems like there might be some mesh errors in this, but I can't tell. Try just doing a mesh merge. Yeah, I don't know what exactly I did there, but I just did an edit mesh merge and merged all this stuff together. Alright, so just by doing this, it should give you pretty much a more or less direct representation of the inside of this thing. You'll notice there is still a little bit of clipping. So what I'm going to do is just sort of harden these loops off. help a little bit, because planes move differently from the rest of things. And then if we also go in, we just need to make sure, again, that everything has, like, those 3 loops on either side of it. So right now I have, like, that top loop I just made. I need to do the center, or the side ones. And then we should have, like, a nice little glass pillar thing, basically, to go in this. Yeah, it's, the mesh was inside out, so I just did a mesh display reverse on it. But doing what I just did, where you basically, like, delete the mesh, or sorry, duplicate the mesh, should give you a little, like, a nice little hole, or piece of geometry that, like, pretty much fits exactly inside the first one. You can also then, if you need to, like, you know, depending on what your margins look like, you can scale it down a little bit as needed. But that's more or less how I would do that. And then let me just really quick, since I'm doing this, well, I know I labeled my stuff better. I just there we go, drinking glass. If you wanted to put a screen under there, what you could do is pretty much just throw a generic little plane. Make sure it's sort of closer to the underside of your object, and maybe assign that a new material. I'm gonna do a weird thing and just make this the eye texture, because I can. I know there's a file texture map to this, so that's not uncomfortable at all. So if we render this, we should get, oh, what are we doing? Very creepy eyeball texture. So I mean, I can go a little bit more into this if you guys are curious, but did that answer your question about sort of matching the?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, definitely. It was answered perfectly.
Sweet. But yeah, so the nice thing about doing the screens like this is it'll give you a little bit of distortion, like if you need it. So like if I don't know, let's just try. You know, you can play with it a little bit to see, like, again, it'll sort of change the way that the screen reacts underneath of things. Also, this would look a little bit less crazy if it was, like, slightly thinner. You wouldn't get that extremely aggressive shadow over the thing, so just, like, depending on, you know, whatever you're going for there. The other thing you can do, which I probably okay, yeah, I'll come back to that later. If you remind me when I go over a mission, I'll show you how to make that screen sort of light up a little bit. Which may be awesome, and it may be terrible. I've actually not tried it in a while, so we'll see. Yeah, what was that? Anyone else have any questions? Alright, cool. In that case, where was I doing? Eyeballs! Haha! Okay, so there's some weird stuff that you can do with eyeballs. And I'm going to start with using basically just like ramp shaders to do things. So I'm actually grumble. So there's certain times when default UVs in Maya are very nice. One of those I will use very frequently is the circle UVs, or torus UVs, which I'll get to in a minute. But the nice thing about this is it will cause a lot of distortion for a file texture, but if you're going for like a stylized eyeball, which is pretty much what I just had, what you can do is very, very easily map a ramp texture into this. And you see by default, it'll pretty much create a very nice gradient from the bottom of your sphere to the top. And then you can tweak those as needed to be, you know, if you wanted like a more fleshy eyeball. Actually, you know what? I've done fleshy eyeballs like 3 times today. Let's make a weird, like, jaundiced eyeball. Sorry. So you can do something like that, and then you can just kind of like push these values back to be, you know, something closer to what you need, add like a pupil in the bottom. The pupil you will probably have to like push out a little bit so you don't see inside of it. But yeah, so you can make some like really, really easy textures on this, just with ramp textures, and this is not a super realistic eye, there's no veining in this, but it's nice if you're just trying to do something quick, or if you're doing a background object, or like for animation 2, which is the other thing I'm teaching this quarter, it's making basically a robot, and a lot of people will use this similar eye setup for their robots. So it's kind of like an interesting thing to be aware of, where sometimes it's not bad, particularly like for eyeballs. It's not always a terrible idea to keep the default UVs, and then you can just sort of set up a custom texture for them. Sometimes because they are so straight and so uniform, it makes it easier to make those custom textures. It's just a weird tidbit. Again, it depends really how you want to texture and like what you're going for. So something similar can also be done for the toruses, which I found to be very, very weird and very satisfying, which also involves a ramp texture. So I'm just going to go ahead and pop that in there. So if we look at the default UVs for the torus, ramp textures don't display well in the UV editor for some reason. They used to, but now they don't. But if we look at this, it's pretty much like a delightful, perfect square grid, which is incredibly ordered and very nice. So what we can do, I mean, you'll notice right now the seam is in the middle, which probably makes a lot of sense, honestly, for the seam. But if we go into this ramp texture, we can do a weird thing where we also make another really, really nice gradient for an eyeball. For some reason, I really like the way, that yellow and red looks for this, so I'm just going to go with the yellow and red route. So off the bat, this looks kind of crazy, and we also, again, we get that seam, which you'll definitely see if you see the character's eye from the side. So what we can do is come in and basically move this yellow to... Actually, I don't want red on the inside. I don't know. Personal preference. What we can do is come down and move this to perfect 50% through the model, which is basically going to be like right on that outside border there. We can squish the yellow in, and then also just make another yellow value on the other side. So basically, because the value at the seam is the exact same thing, it pretty much eliminates that seam entirely. And then you have this very, very nice looking little shaded eyeball thing. You can also do weird stuff, which I'm just gonna preview something very funny. I'm just gonna move this UV shell up and down. You can see the eye is just like strobing. So totally irrelevant for your class, but it is kind of funny and weirdly satisfying. Yeah, one of my monitors keeps cutting out because the cable doesn't fit it super well, but you know, whatever. Later problems. Alright, so that was my weird bit pretty much on most of the UVing stuff. So before we go forward away from this... Actually, no, sorry, there was one more thing I wanted to go over. Before I do that, anyone have any questions on the stuff I just did? Alright. Excellent. Alright, so I think the other bit was basically, every once in a while I will design UVs around file textures that I find. And in this case, I found this horrendously perfect eyeball texture. So you can just design... I've done this before and it works really nicely. You can just design your UVs around that instead of having to, like, mash this onto some weird UV you made. Like, if you know you have this texture, use that texture. So all I did for this, if we pop open the UV editor, you'll see that here's my texture, here's my UVs. All I did to make this texture... Come back, monitor. Ooh, that was not it. So I just applied a planar map to this, and by default, I mean, it's, you know, a lot of white border on that, kind of stupid looking. So what I did is I basically cut on the inside... It is an eye donut. Gross. You don't even understand. I make cakes and stuff, and now I do actually want to make eyeball donuts. You could do it with certain pouring of icing techniques. Anyway, or get really weird with it and hand paint fondant, which is a whole thing. Anyway, sorry. So I'm just gonna grab the two outer... I'm basically trying to make two donut UVs. So I'm gonna grab the outer ring and the inner ring in the middle. I'm gonna go ahead and cut those like normal. And I like unfolding stuff. I don't like UV stretching on the side of my eyes. And if you unfold this, it still stays pretty much perfectly uniform circle. And then what you can do is just grab both of these and just scale them down. And then it is a lovely, delightful eyeball. There is still obviously a little bit of seam, but it's pretty minimal. The textures are similar enough that it's not a huge problem. And you're probably looking at me, or looking at whatever I'm doing, and being like, but you're overlapping UVs. Why are you doing this? Yes. This is one of those instances where, like, overlapping UVs makes sense. For a few reasons. So one, in this case, it's helping camouflage the seam here. And two, strictly speaking, I mean, this is an eyeball. You're never really going to need to see the back of it. so it's not a huge concern if the texture is duplicated. And also it's, you know, kind of the back of an eyeball. Again, it's one of those things where, like, if you're not going to see it, it's not a huge issue. And this is one of those things where maybe if I was doing, like, a medical model of this eyeball, my monitor's dead again. If I was doing, like, a medical model that I had to, you know, do the thing where they, like, split it apart, I would texture that separately. But realistically, for animating, again, that's not an area that I'm going to use very often, so I'm not going to worry too much about it. The other option for the UVs is basically to either do one of two things. Take that back shell and either cut it in a different spot so that the seam is less noticeable, or just take this back shell and, like, to avoid clipping, you know, stick it somewhere off on the corner of the model, and you could, you know, make that its own texture or something not white. But I really need to fix this monitor. In this case, it's just kind of, you know, very quick and easy and causes no harm to have overlapping UVs. Now, where you don't want to have overlapping UVs is, like, main objects of your model. So, I mean, even in the instance of doing something like with this face, where, like, if you have, particularly if this character is freckled, it looks a little bit weird to have perfectly symmetrical freckles. Or have you ever needed to do something where, like, this character gets a cut on their face, or they put, like, war paint on their face? If you have overlapping UVs basically divided, like, straight down the face, like, straight down this way, that's going to be perfectly symmetrical all the time. Now, depending on what you're doing, it might not be the end of the world, but it's also, you know, for future usability, main object pieces I will usually use separate and just sort of texture them separately, and that way, if I need to use them in a different way in the future, I can. And I can do it in a way that doesn't involve me, you know, re-UVing the object and then, like, redoing all the textures because I redid the UVs. Also, things for stuff. Things like from the Modeling 1 assignment, stuff like the handles for the wire cutters and stuff like that. Normally it's a good idea, if that's, like, one of your main objects, to leave that separate as well. Just because it gives you more flexibility to, you know, not have duplicate scratches in exactly the same spot, which does kind of stand out a little bit. Someone asked in my last class, is it ever, for, like, duplicated objects, does it make sense to have overlapping UVs? And that was one of my things where it depends on this situation. It's not always bad, but it's also not always good. So, like I said, main objects are, like, particularly for these assignments, like, this is one object you're rendering in frame, you should probably not be duplicating UVs. But for stuff like little things, like accents, like screws, a lot of times, like, so any of you who did the newer light, you know there's, like, a lot of screws on that thing. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll make, like, 2 or 3 versions of the same screw, and then I'll go through and texture each one differently, and then just sort of scatter them around the model, rotate them around a little bit. That just gives a little bit of variation where it's minimal extra effort on your part to do, but it gives a little bit more variation so it's not obvious all the screws are, like, perfectly duplicates of each other. So I think that actually is pretty much all of my bits on the random stuff. Oh, so for the screws, I was thinking, like, if you have a lot of screws, like, on... I feel like if I Google steampunk cake... Actually, I'm trying to find, like, a useful example, because I feel like steampunk stuff has a lot of screws in it. Or not. Okay, maybe. Who knows? These are all really weird. Sure. Okay, this is actually a decent example. So for something like this, it's all the same screw. It's just rotated a little bit differently. The rotating helps a lot. But this is one of those things where I might, you know, make 2 or 3 versions of this screw, since it's being used in the front of the object all really close to each other. So the model is exactly the same. I just shift the UVs so they're not overlapping, and I have I can texture 2 or 3 different versions of the screw to give a little bit more variation whenever I'm, you know, attaching these to the object. Does that kind of make sense? Sweet. But yeah, so that was actually all of my bits on the UV things. Any questions before we go on? All right, cool. So in that case, I think there is... Yes, I'm going to demo that. And then, my monitor. driving me crazy. Okay. Yes, I wanted to show you how to do something like I have for the floor. Again, I think I talked about this a little bit in a previous. Oh god, that is truly vile. Oh look, and now this is showing up. I kind of want to make this like super Halloween themed. Are we feeling like Halloween vibe for the rest of this? Anyway, sorry. Also partly me. I've done this 3 times today. I'm trying to keep things a little bit less repetitive on my end. Alright, so if we look at this table, basically I've used one black and white internet texture to create something that's a little bit more interesting to look at in terms of the table pattern itself. So I did want to show you guys how to do that, because it's kind of nice to know how to do. It's also a good intro to the Hypershade, which is what most of the rest of this is going to be, so I figured this was a good place to start. Way too many textures in this. I actually have no idea. I've never really paid attention to like when St. Patrick's Day is. I remember when I was at Drexel, I would always just see a bunch of random people running around in like green stuff, being eccentric, and I was like, okay, cool. Alright, so this is one of those instances where, in this case, this is the only one that I could find that tiled, for some reason. But normally if you Google black and white texture, you'll find a lot of tileable patterns like this. And if you're going to do one of the things that I'm going to do, the tiling part is important. So what I'm going to do is basically use that to create this whole texture like you see here. And I'm actually not going to start with the color channel. I'm going to do something with that later. So what I'm going to do is map this into metalness. For some reason, I like the little bit of shiny in it. I think it's fun. It'll be really good for like embroidery flowers or something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab this dude and throw it in here, and oh god, it's doing the wall too. Excellent. Alright, so this is what we have. It looks terrible. I need to go in and take the stupid Alpha's Luminance button, and now we have something that is very overtly partially metal and partly not, and it looks terrible, and it's amazing. Alright, I'm going to render partial of this in the bottom. So what we want to do is basically go through, first of all, I think the texture is too large. You can see that there's a little bit of, like, if we zoom in here, it's going to get a little bit softer on the edges because it's just a low-res texture that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is go into this Place 2D Texture node, and I think I mentioned this before to you guys. I'm going to go ahead and repeat U and V, and you can do this, you know, if I wanted to make the texture super tiny, I could make this, that was maybe too super tiny. If I wanted to make this, like, really small, I could do 20. And have like a really small subtle texture, or in this case I'm going to do maybe like 7. So you can repeat these. The beauty of this, apart from just being able to shrink your texture, which is convenient, is that you can use a very small resolution image. Like you could use something that's like 200 pixels and stretch it across the entire screen if it's designed to tile. If it's not designed to tile, like, this image is not designed to tile. Wait. The lag is real. I should probably stop rendering this. Don't you crash on me. No. No. Oh, right, sorry, I'm just being an idiot and I forgot how computers work. Sorry. So, like, this is not designed to tile. This is what will happen. It's gonna add, basically, extra fake seams into your stuff. It's gonna look really terrible. And that is, frankly, the only reason that we are using this awful, awful houndstooth texture for things, is because it does tile, and I like my stuff to tile nicely. Alright, so we're going to take this, and we're going to throw this into a bunch of different channels, and this is where the Hypershade comes in. So basically, Hypershade, you can get to it with this little ball here. If you prefer the menus, it is Windows, Rendering Editor, and Hypershade. But basically, what it's going to show you is a few different things. So it gives you a delightful little preview of your texture, which is sort of convenient. You can also change, you know, what that's attached to if you want to. A lot of weird options in here. I'm curious about the hair. Nope. Whole lot of nope. Alright, sorry. So, sometimes I get a little spazzy starting to play with things. Alright, so it's going to show you all the different materials in your scene. So like any of your like accidental surfaces, Lamberts, this all shows up here. Also by default, just in case you guys were curious, these Lambert 1, Particle Cloud, and Shader Glow, these are all default things. You can't delete them. They're there forever. It'll also show you in these other tabs all of your file textures or ramp textures or any other random stuff you have in there, as well as some others, assorted things that you don't really need to worry about for now. So like I said, render preview. This is basically a duplicate of your attribute editor, just directly in your Hypershade. So that's there just for ease of use. And then this is where stuff gets fun. And by fun, I mean really chaotic if you let it. I'm actually going to show you, I'm going to show you how to set this up later. It's going to be great. But what I'm going to do is just go ahead and clean out this, this little clear graph button right here. Just get rid of all of that nonsense. And what I'm going to do is find my, I'm going to relabel this so I actually know what I'm looking for, because I have way too much stuff in here. Alright, so I'm going to grab this, and I'm going to hit this little plus button to add it to my, my graph editor down there. And then I would like to see the incoming connections and all of the outgoing connections to this file. So I'm going to go ahead, there's this little square button with 2 arrows in it, grab that, and it's going to show you anything plugged into this texture and anything coming out of this texture. So this is really handy for figuring out just like what's happening with bump maps and stuff like that. And actually, I'll come back to that in a second. It does occur to me that I do actually want to add a bump map to this. And for my bump map, I do, for some reason, I'm really obsessed with this gloss texture in Maya. So I'm just going to set this to a smaller value because I know that pretty much cloth should never be left at a full bump value of 1. I'm also going to come in and be like 150 because smaller cloth. Give that a render. Beautiful. It's super ugly, and that's okay. But yeah, so just a little goofy bump map in there. We'll come back and we'll sort of tweak that later so it looks a little bit less crazy. But you'll notice that also, when we go back in our Hypershade, anything we add is just going to like go in there as like, hey, look, you've added the thing. Alright. So that's basically that. Nav in this is basically the same like scroll wheel. You can pan with the middle mouse button. And then the scrolling is also sort of cursor dependent, so it's gonna target whatever your cursor's pointing at. That's mostly that. You can click on any of this stuff, drag around. The dragging around doesn't really do anything, it just keeps you organized. If you did want to delete something, you could just go ahead and delete that, and then it would, delete that. So be wary of that. But yeah, these function basically just like normal little objects in Maya, so if you do delete it, just hit delete. So what I'm going to do is, if I wanted to, I could go in and say, I want to map some roughness into this, or, some color or anything else like that. What I could do is come in, go into my texture, stop rendering. Go into my texture, I could, do the thing where I map a file in, and then I pick the file again. But if I do that, it's not ideal for a few reasons. One, it's a lot of mouse clicks. Two, it's going to be basically, Maya's going to be pulling that file every single time you're using it, so it's less efficient on your rendering. And also, like if I pull this in now, this is not going to have the same, it's going to look really stupid, but it's not going to have the same size or scale as this metalness texture I added, so I would have to go in and manually, every single file, like change that to be the same value. Cool, 7's actually too small, maybe I want 5. I would have to change that every single place I pulled in that texture, which is really annoying. I've done it before, and it sucks. So what we're going to do instead is pop into our Hypershade and use this one cloth texture for all of the things. So basically, I want to go ahead and just delete all this bump stuff that was coming out of there. That's just going to basically unmap it, right? So if we look at our texture now, it's registering nothing in bump, and that's fine. That's what we want. So what I'm going to do is, this is where the Hypershade gets really fun. I'm going to grab the out color of this metal, and of this awful houndstooth file texture. Grab out color, and I'm going to try to throw it into Specular Roughness. I realized I shouldn't have deleted the bump map, actually. I was going for the Specular Roughness map, and deleted the wrong thing, because I'm a dingus. Alright. Cool. Okay, sorry. So I'm trying to actually put this texture into Specular Roughness. So if we grab out color, you just click and drag with the left mouse button on this little scrolly bit thing, And you'll notice that it's grayed out Specular Roughness, which is the value that I'm trying to actually use. So basically what that tells you is out color is made of 3 values. You have an R, a G, and a B. Specular Roughness only takes 1 value. So it wants either the R, or the G, or the B, not all of them at once. In this case, it doesn't really matter which one you use, because it's a grayscale image, they're all the same value. So I just expand that little, like this little plus button here, grab the R, and throw it directly in Specular Roughness. And you'll notice that it's when I did that, it changed the render a little bit, so you can kind of see the old one in the back where we have this like really aggressive metal texture in here. This is a lot more subtle. So before I go any further, I'm also going to do this a few more times for other stuff. Does anybody have any questions so far? Alright, cool. So, this does not give us a huge amount of flexibility, because maybe I don't like the way that this roughness looks, and I don't. I think it looks really stupid. So we can get a little bit more control on this with some ramp textures in Maya, and basically running this through a few ramp textures into our file, because ramp textures basically will remap the color of an image. So what I'm going to do is hit Tab anywhere in this little area thing down here, and just type in ramp. The ramp you will want is the ramp texture, but anything you search in here, like if you know what you're looking for, you just start typing it, it's gonna search and pull up all the relevant names. So in this case, like I said, ramp texture is the one that you want. It's gonna give us one of these little dudes, same thing we use for our eyeballs. And what I am going to do is expand this UV chord thing, grab the out color from the R, put that into my V chord. Strictly speaking, the only reason I'm using V chord is because by default, this type of this ramp is set to V ramp. If I wanted to use U chord, I could do that. I would just need to set the value to U ramp instead. However, putting this into V chord means that I don't need to do those extra 3 mouse clicks, and I am a fan of not doing 3 extra mouse clicks. If you do this a lot, it adds up. But anywho, so I'm going to throw the out color R into the V chord, and then grab, again, the out color R from here, and throw that into my Specular Roughness. And notice if you're keeping the render in the background, which seems still going, you'll notice that nothing's really changed. However, if we start changing the color of this ramp texture, it's going to start changing how this looks. So you'll notice, like, if we set this to be a slightly darker value, we get those shiny metal areas back again. So basically what this is doing, you can kind of see a preview of it here, is it's basically remapping the color from the original image based on your settings of the ramp texture. And the way that you tell what exactly is happening, so basically when you make a ramp, anything that is to the, by default, black side is going to be the darker values of the image. And then anything on the white side is going to be the whiter values of the image. So that's how you figure out like which sort of side, I guess, you're modifying. And then to determine the actual values you want for this, there's a few things you could do. I mean, one is just like me doing what I'm doing now, is like, I don't know what this, like, yeah, I'm just going to kind of randomly slider value stuff, yay! So that's an option, just kind of randomly pick values to get something you like. The other option is, if you know what setting you're looking at, right, so like, roughness is going to be black, or a value of 0 is going to be not rough at all, versus white, or a value of 1, which is going to be extremely rough. So if you know what slider you're looking for, you can kind of know, like, okay, cool, like if I make this black instead of white, this is going to be shinier than if I make this extremely white. So that's just kind of like different ways you can sort of like pick, you know, the slider values. It really just depends on like kind of the look you're going for. So that's basically remapping stuff through a ramp. I'm gonna do this a few more times because I'm gonna do this in a few more attributes here, but does anybody have any questions about that? Alright. Cool. Okay, so we have this for now, and that's all fine and dandy, but let's say that I don't like this ugly white texture. What are we to do about that? Well, we could slider value it to a different random shade, And I'm feeling, like I said, the Halloween vibe of this, so I will be making this probably black with some kind of shiny orangish overlay. So what I'm going to do is make myself another ramp texture, because I do love ramp textures. And do exactly the same thing I just did, where I take the outcolor R from my file texture and put it into my vchord, and then I grab the outcolor R from that ramp, and oops, sorry. So I'm going to grab the outcolor R, and notice that I cannot plug that into the color channel. So what I can do is actually just grab the outcolor, all of the outcolor, and put that into base color. Because base color also takes RGB values. This is exporting our values. I'm able to just actually export all of that. Basically, if it grays the outcolor out, you just grab one of these values. If it allows you to take all this, you just take the whole outcolor. But what I can do now, and this is where it gets really weird, it's actually, I should just modify this over here, it'll be easier to see the render. So what you can do is basically go in and make this whatever the heck random color you want. That is not a color that should ever happen, especially with this horrible, horrible Mountain Dew vibe we have going on. Wow. But basically, again, so like any darker values in this are going to be mapped to this little light green, whatever, not light green, fluorescent green, and any white values are going to be mapped into this pink. Yeah, this is hardcore bowling out of the carpet vibe. So you can remap stuff this way. So I actually will do this a lot, like if pulling in file textures. You can also, if you want to get like really, really weird with it, let me actually just make this some kind of maybe black with scary gold overlay, so I have something to kind of come back to. Ew, that's okay. All right, cool. Gray with awkward overlay. Okay. Gray is actually a really bad example color, so I'm gonna pick something less weird, like my jaundiced eye green. Yes, it's beautiful. Okay. But you can see again, we're starting. It's sort of depending on the colors you choose will be more obvious, but you can see that kind of like shiny metal look in there. Cats are being weird in the background. But yeah, so are you guys with me so far? There's like one more weird thing I can do with this. Hopefully. Alright, so if I was so inclined, you'll notice that the selected color does allow me to map in additional colors. I could put another ramp texture in this. And if we, I actually don't really need to show you the render for this, but if we zoom out on this, you'll notice that it's going from black to white. So if you did want to add additional random variation into this, perhaps mix this delightful putrid green color with a slightly brighter putrid green color, we could do that in any kind of rampy combination you want. There's also different types of ramps, like you could use, circular ramps if you were into that. Pretty much anything like you would find for a gradient in Photoshop, they have all that stuff here. You can also, though, and this is why I like ramps, you can add noise into your ramps. Where if you look at the preview here, it'll just make it kind of blotchy and silly. So that's, pretty much all I really wanted to go over with that. So this is a thing you can do again, where it's just started from like a single internet texture, but from that internet texture we got like kind of an interesting looking pattern from it. It didn't take terribly long. The downside of this, I mean, this will be really easy to make in Photoshop. I just don't like opening Photoshop if I don't have to. The downside of doing texturing like this is there's not a great way to export this. Like if I wanted to put this in, an online photo, like an online model viewer or something like that, there's not a great way to do that because everything you've done is in Maya, so those textures don't really export as well. Just something to be aware of for these assignments. Doesn't really make a lick of difference. Alright, so that is pretty much that. Before we pop into some more Hypershade stuff, does anybody have any questions about this? Alrighty then. Okay, so the next thing I want to show you guys is displacement maps. And you will notice, if you look at this head, that this particular chunk of geometry is very much not what's rendering. This is because it's basically a glorified bump map that does fancier things at render time. So I do want to show you guys how to set that up. What you normally need to do, actually give me 5 seconds, let me just like set this object back to the default values because I tweaked some stuff when I was messing with it. So ignore everything I'm doing right now. Default values, okay, cool. Okay. Yeah, this is also, apparently this map is just like a random tree bark. You'll also notice that it looks significantly lower resolution after I change some values, but I'll go over all that stuff in a second. So basically, again, and I'll actually, since I have this up, I'll show you a difference between a bump map and a, not bump map, and a displacement map. So just leaving all my values as like standard for the bump maps, and grabbing. So this is a thing that I grabbed from CG Textures. Just like I said, I just grabbed a random thing that looked like it had a lot of texture to it. So you'll notice that that's bizarre. Oh, wait, sorry. That is actually really weird. That shouldn't have any displacement on it. What? Let me really quick refresh this in case my render view is being stupid. Yes, okay, cool. My render view is being stupid. So you'll notice like this is a displacement map and this is a bump map, where the bump map is not affecting the profile of the object, whereas the displacement map very much is. So that's mostly the difference between the two, honestly. Displacement maps take longer to render, they're a little bit more annoying to set up. They also, though, they do tend to make better shadows on things, and they just look obviously more realistic. So if we look particularly like at the shadows under these little lumpy bits, you can see, like, as we move around, this is making much nicer looking shadows than whatever this is. So normally you would use displacement maps if you do need that profile change in the object. So for something like if you were to do a displacement map for these little wood grain, or the little cloth details we put in the floor, hardcore overkill. You could do it, there's no real reason to do it. So this really is, again, I don't imagine you guys will be needing these super for much of anything. I just wanted you guys to know that they're there, because it is an option for texturing going forward. I'm not really going to go over how to make these yourself. That's like a thing that I do in sort of CGI2, because it's it can be a little bit annoying. But this is an option for stuff. In case you do find internet textures you want to use with these, I will show you how to set them up though. It's not hard, like I said, just like 2 or 3 little like random options that you need to choose that are like kind of weird and annoying. Alright, so if we have this head, I'm going to go ahead and assign this delightful thing a new material. And I'm going to refresh my render view because it's clearly not paying attention to what I'm doing. Yes, all the puns. And now for some reason I'm just doing like hit me with your best shot, but like hit me with your best pun, and it's just going over and over in my head, so thank you for that. Alright. So we have our lovely new texture here. I'm gonna call this Displacement. I'm gonna spell displacement wrong, just for the heck of it. So there's actually, the default values here are actually not where you plug in the displacement map. So you can get to the node you need in one of 2 ways. You can click on this little back button, and that will take you to this area, which is where you add a displacement map. Or, you can, oh my lord. Yay! Or you can find your displacement shader here, and just pop it open in the Hypershade, and you can just click on this thing, and that'll bring you to it. This, a lot of times, I think is just easier, because you don't need to, like, dig through these weird little buttons and get yourself lost in Maya's backend stuff. So all you want to do is, at this point, it's pretty much exactly the same as plugging in a bump map, where you just grab your file texture. If you are downloading this from something like textures.com, the height map is the one that you want to use. Alright, so we grab that, throw that on, clearly your head has vanished. Amazing. If your render editor is being crazy or your render view is being stupid, you just need to refresh that. And you can see that now we are getting a little bit of displacement in the head here. However, very much not what we had before, and it doesn't look, it's like a little bit fuzzy, it doesn't quite look as nice. So there's a few things that you should be aware of if you are trying to add displacement maps into things, and just like settings that you need to change. So the first setting is normally you need to set the color space, and this is just in the file node where you upload the file. You need to set the color space to raw. What that does is basically allows the file to pull more data than just like standard color shows. So we get like a heck of a lot more detail from doing that. So that's a thing you normally need to do. Sometimes you also need to set the filtering turned off, but that really depends on where you're getting your file textures from. I just sort of toggle that on and off, see if it does something. That's obviously not a great workflow, but kind of what I do a lot of times. If you are getting files from a particular source, a lot of times there'll be resources online going over specifically like what settings you should use to import these into Arnold, so that might be worth checking out if you're having trouble with it. This is like super creepy. Alright, so that's the stuff you normally need to take in the file window. There are a few other options that will usually make your displacement map look a little bit better and or fix errors with your displacement map, just casual here. Before we go any farther, are you guys with me with like where to plug that stuff in? Again, it's this little node basically that comes off the surface shader itself. Alright. So the other things, the other things that you might need to edit are actually in the settings. They're actually in the settings for the object itself. So if we click on this object and we go into, let me just close all this stuff, the shape node for your object, go under the Arnold tab and scroll down until you find the Subdivision and Displacement Attributes tab. Dang it. Oh, right, I fixed it on the other one. Never mind. Alright, so by default, the type is going to be set to none for smoothing, or for subdivision. Basically what this tab does is it gives you fake additional subdivisions or fake additional geometry at render time. So every once in a while, like you'll notice we're kind of losing a little bit of detail up here. So what I'm going to do is just set this, both of these are just different formulas for smoothing stuff. Cat Clark is short for Catmull Clark, and that is just the smoothing that Maya normally uses. So if you hit the 3 key, like that's Catmull Clark smoothing in Maya. So I'm going to use Cat Clark, and then you'll normally need to set the number of iterations up a little bit higher. So, I mean, turning it down to 0 is basically like not having smoothing on it. And then at some point it's just overkill. You don't need extra smoothing, and this is, you can see it's taking significantly longer to render. So do be aware of that. I mean, this is a setting that will pretty directly affect your render times, but sometimes it's also necessary to get the, oh lordy. Sometimes it's also necessary to get the desired amount of displacement. Oh god. Please don't crash. I shouldn't have set that up to 7. Maybe don't set that up to 7. So fun fact that we're going to talk about with smoothing a model while my computer is trying to cry itself to sleep. Every time, so if you start with a cube and you subdivide that cube, the number of polygons goes from 6 to 24. So every time you subdivide your model, it is getting 4 times as much geometry as you had previously. So by setting this up to 7, I've done something very, very bad. Where, you know, if this was a cube, that would be like 24 times 4, which would be like 100, which would go up to like 400 some, which would go up, so that would take a cube. 7 subdivisions later would be like over 1,000 polys, and this head was already really dense. So that was a very dumb thing that I just did there. Guys, I think I found the limit of my new computer. Can y'all still hear me alright, at least? Well, this is trying to murder itself. Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent. Alright, I think I might just need to force quit Maya here. Bummer. Okay. Well, at least I know what I shouldn't do to my computer now. Cough, cough. Well, while I'm waiting for that, anyone have any questions? There we go. Right. Sweet delights, come on. I also have I have an SSD now instead of a old hard drive, so now things are actually like faster and it's nice. All right. Great. Eyeball texture 2. Alright, so we're going to lose all of our delightful Mountain Dew textures. That's sad. This is why I should save versions of your files, but I don't care because it's a demo file. Alright, so basically I can get back to where it was in 5 seconds. And it's like trying to load so aggressively. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and just go back to where it was before with the rendering. Delightful. Delightful. Alright. So there's a few common things if you're importing, particularly with homemade render displacement maps. There's a few things that you might find that happen. So one of those is, and they can all kind of be fixed with this Displacement Attributes tab. So still in the Shape node, under the Arnold tab, scroll down, Displacement Attributes. So you can modify the height of this. Like if you think this is, too much displacement, you could set that to be 0.5. You could also do something really crazy and set this to be something like 5. And that, okay, we'll do that. I don't necessarily recommend doing that. I'm doing that now to illustrate an issue with the displacement map. You will notice at the top there is this area that has just been flattened and totally chopped off. That is a weird, it's like a bounding box issue basically, where sometimes it just sort of, you need to tell Maya manually like, hey, you can extrude this farther. Which you also do. You can also actually see very edge of this, you can see it's making basically like a hard box around your object. That's something that bounds padding can fix. So it's 0. If you set that up to 1, usually that will fix all of the issues where you can see now this is actually extending fully on all sides of the object, except apparently up here because I've made the value ridiculously extreme. So you can set that up more or less as high as you need it so that you don't have that clipping. Honestly, I've never found I don't think this really affects your render time, so I don't really know why it would be, set to 0 by default. So I mean, theoretically we set it to 10, and again, it seems to render just as fast, so who the heck knows. That, honestly, is pretty much mostly displacement maps. I'll set this down a little bit so it's still pretty messed up, but a little bit less messed up than it was. But like I said, these are good for if you do need that specific up-close geometry, or another example would be if you're trying to, I know like the hot glue gun from this week has a little bit of like texture on the side. I think it would still make sense for this week to stick to like a bump map for it, but if you ever did need to zoom up really, really close to that, and it became very obvious, sorry, if it became very obvious that it was a bump map up close, you could switch it to a displacement map, and then you would get that little bit of like nicer texture in the object. But yeah, so that's displacement maps. I had one more texturing thing to go over, and then neon signs. So before I do that, any questions on displacements? Alrighty then. Yeah, I think the hot glue was definitely one of the more organic models that I gave you guys this week, which I would be super into because I love organic models. But yeah, now you know what you like and what you don't like doing. All right. So I mentioned in the assignment, if you were gonna do something pseudo-procedural with your texturing, drop me a note about it so I know what you're doing. This is that pseudo-procedural thing. So you see I have these 2 delightful spheres set up here with random textures that I got from textures.com. This is some kind of moss texture with very extreme displacement on it, and this is some kind of random little, like, I don't know, stone texture is what I was going for. So these are just the textures. Why actually? Okay, there we go. So like I said, those spheres that I showed you are just these unmodified internet textures just chilling here. This is what I don't want you to see doing. This is what I don't want to see you doing for a specific assignment, is just sort of throwing a texture on and calling it a day. Because again, usually it's not going to work on your model. I can usually tell if that's a thing that you've done. But there is a way to combine these. So let's imagine that, like, if I'm trying to texture some kind of like nice wall or like a walk path or whatever, with stone with some moss eaten into it kind of thing. There's an easy way to set that up so that you can use internet textures as a base for things and basically create maps for it later. So you can see I've done it here with this. Clicking all the wrong buttons. You can see I've done it here. The texture doesn't show up in the viewport, unfortunately, which is annoying. But this is basically the default texture from this thing, and also from the moss. The downside of doing this is I have not been able to figure out a way to get the displacement map to transfer over nicely. So I'm not going to go over how to copy displacement over. You guys shouldn't really need to be doing that for this course anyway, so probably not a huge issue. Just be aware of that the displacement won't carry over nicely. You will have to jump through a lot of hoops to get that to port over. But what you can do, I'll show you how to set this up, basically. It's actually pretty straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and assign this a new material like I would normally. Except in this case, instead of using a standard surface shader, I'm going to use an AI mix shader. By default, that's black and it looks really stupid. We have, I'm going to call this mix wheel. So these are really the only attributes that you have to add into this. You have a spot for shader 1 and shader 2, and you have a mix weight. So what you want to do to actually make this display something not black and stupid looking is pop open your attribute editor, and you want to grab I'm just going to grab, here's my moss texture, I'm going to middle mouse button drag and throw that in shader 1, and then I have my concrete texture, and I'm going to throw that in shader 2. And you'll see that as I do that, now we get something, actually displaying here. In this case, it's kind of a gross combination. It's like a green version of this without displacement, which looks really nasty. So there is a slider value here. And this is going to basically toggle back and forth. A value of 0 is going to show shader 1, and a value of 1 is going to show shader 2. So depending on how you toggle back and forth between these, it's going to affect the way the shader looks. And note that you can map textures into this. So basically, I'll just throw a quick checker texture on here. If I do that, now certain areas have a value of 0 or moss, and certain textures have a value of 1 or concrete. So you can use this, and if you use it with something less dumb than a checker texture, you can very easily sort of combine different textures into each other, which is just like really handy when you're texturing. So a lot of times what I'll do, and unfortunately I cannot demo this with custom textures right now. Photoshop is a weird thing. I have to jump through hoops to get reinstalled on my computer. I got it 10 years ago. It's on my dad's Photoshop account, and it's for a Mac, so every time I have to do it, I have to call Adobe and be like, Adobe, I need you to switch this stuff for me, help me. And I haven't been able to get a hold of them yet. So, I will demo this with assorted InMaya textures, and you can just use photo maps on your own. It's pretty much the same thing you did last week with like generating UVs for stuff. Alright, so we can see this toggle, super delightful. Anybody have any questions so far before I pop into more fun with ramp textures? Yes, you can also do textures like plastic. So let me make another duplicate piece of eyeball, because that is in fact what this is. So you can do a bunch of weird stuff with this. You can make like a balloon texture. I feel like that would be fun. Screw it, I'll just do Chrome. Too lazy to find balloon. Alright, so what you can do is, depending on the textures you map in, this is actually probably a slightly better demo anyway. If I put in this theoretical Chrome shader instead of the other ones, you can see we have like very different attributes for these. So a lot of times, like what I'll personally use this for is doing something like, adding, if I have like a painted surface I want metal scratches in, I'll make a texture for the paint and a texture for the scratches, and then I will just use a map to blend between them. So basically anywhere where I map in like a black and white scratch, it's going to show that scratch texture. So it's really handy for stuff like that. It's also really good for like last week's assignments actually, to add in stuff like rust. So for this, like, you could grab a generic internet texture for Rust, which looks really nice, and they have all the nice, normal maps and stuff like that for it. And then what you could do is come in with Photoshop and say, like, okay, I want Rust here, here, here. And you could, like, add in those very targeted smudges, export a single map from Photoshop, and then plug it into a mix shader, and not have to export, like, 8,000 maps for roughness and stuff like that. So, okay. Okay, so I actually don't know if that did that answer your question? Or I think I might have misread your question. Alright, so I'll come back to that if I see another chat message, I guess. For now, we proceed with Chrome Moss. Okay, so what I'm going to do is basically come back. I'm going to come back to the shader because it looks terrible. I'm going to break my mix weight. So now we have that same, you can kind of see the mix weight here, where it's like that. Oh, I see. How would you texture a plastic ball? So they have, I mean, there's plastic presets for things, actually. So if you just go into, I'll retexture this one. Oops. So there's presets for just like plastic that you can start with somewhere in here. Plastic. Depending on what kind of plastic you're going for, they may or may not be what you want. It also looks like it's using, oh, right, because I have a bunch of other random maps plugged into this, so it's just like keeping my roughness maps and my bump maps and my displacement maps. It's kind of weird. But what you could do is like start with the plastic preset and then just kind of go from there. But honestly, plastic textures, unless you need, so I usually go through and I'll just sort of like slider value for the different, I will usually slider values. Okay, I need to break this displacement map. Hang on a sec. What? What is going on right now? Yeah, I actually, hang on a sec. Let me fix this, whatever is happening here. What? Okay, I genuinely don't know why there's still a displacement map on this, so, oh, it's because I haven't refreshed my stupid render view. I'm willing to bet that's why it's doing that. Yep. I hate Arnold. Okay. I actually have some videos about mapping fingerprints and stuff. I'll talk really quickly about it, but I can actually just throw those up later. Or like link them if you guys want them. But where was I going? Alright, so we have this delightful preset for plastic. So a lot of times for plastic, I'll just sort of decide, like, I'm gonna make this a little bit grayer so it's easier to see what's happening. Just kind of like decide like how rough you want it. But I find the presets are a pretty good base for plastic a lot of the times. And then if you want, you can play with something like diffuse roughness, which I find a lot of times functionally it sort of darkens things a little bit. But yeah, so I'd get like a base texture for that, and then I would go in and add stuff like smudges. So let's pretend, I guess really quick, that I have, this is going to be a really bad demo of a fingerprint for the record, but let's see what I can find. Ooh, look at this delightful black and white image, how exciting. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save this image as thumb, fingerprint, whatever it's labeled by default, and we're going to go ahead and plug this into my file texture. So, let us assume that we want to modify the roughness, because I'm assuming that if there's an oil deposit on this gross little fingerprint that I'm about to add, it's going to look different from the rest of things. So, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pop in my, actually, you know what, heck with it. I know I'm going to go in here anyway, so I'm just going to do this all in the Hypershade. So, what I'm going to do is hit tab and look for my file texture. I want a file texture. This is the same thing, it's not hooked up to anything, but it's the exact same thing as creating a file texture through the attribute editor. So I'm going to go ahead and pick my sad little file, which I probably saved to my downloads folder. Nope, I didn't. Great. I'm going to go ahead and open that up, and I'm going to assume that this render is probably going to look really, really bad by default. And or that my stupid thing is not going to display properly, and that seems to be what's happening, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. Grumble. Cool. Show me something? Maybe? Alright, so a lot of oh, right. Remember when I was just like, hey, these file textures aren't hooked up to anything, and I'm like, why isn't my render updating? Because I haven't hooked the file texture up. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to map this into a ramp texture. Because I know that as I'm doing this, I'm probably going to need to flip these values around, and I know that I'm not going to want a perfectly matte versus perfectly shiny fingerprint. That's going to look really strange. So I'm going to grab the out color R, throw that into my V, and then just grab the R, and again, throw that in Specular Roughness. Hey, we have a fingerprint. Cool. How exciting. Alright, so now, like I said, you'll probably need to modify the values of this. Of that ramp texture, and the other thing you can do is, let's say we want smaller fingerprints on this. Cool. Alright, so maybe, okay, I'll do something maybe like 3, just so it's not such a giant. Now we have like fingerprints kind of on the edges of things. It makes a little bit more sense. And actually, that does actually seem to be pretty much the values that I wanted, more or less. But what I want to do is basically go in with this ramp texture. You can change the sort of how this is interpolated. You can see it's giving you basically a little bit like less aggressive fingerprint with a little bit less of that like weird sort of line around the outside. None is weird. Probably not what you want for this. Anywho, I'm just going to stick with this. But what you can do is change these values a little bit, right? So like if I didn't want, this is roughness, so this is totally rough. Probably makes sense for the fingerprint, honestly, but for the back, I don't want that to be like completely black. Like maybe I did want that a little bit shinier. So you can slider value that up a little bit. And this is all things, again, you could do in Photoshop. I'm just used to doing it without Photoshop, and I hate Photoshop. So you can do it in Maya if you want to. So that'll be something like a fingerprint. The other thing you could do for this is pop that into a bump map. So what I would do for this is, again, actually, you know what, I'm not even going to put a ramp in this. I'm just going to grab the out color R and put that into... it's probably going to yell at me. Probably not set that up correctly. Yeah, that looks awful. So a lot of times for bump maps, what I need to do is like kind of annoying. Where was I? So I found this thing. Oftentimes I will go down to my geometry tab and just like set up the file texture for it. And then what you can do is come in, once you have this bump 2D node, like that's kind of the thing that you need to hook it up. You can grab your either out color or out alpha. It's not going to make a huge difference. Grab that and pop it into your bump value, except in this case, it wants a black and white value, so I have to grab either the R or the G or the B. And then it'll give you this, and this actually looks really bad, so I probably should have put that in a ramp texture. Stop me if you guys have questions as I go, by the way. I'm just sort of... A lot of this is like very sort of repetitive stuff, so I'm sort of assuming that it makes sense unless I'm told otherwise. Alright, so now the texture still looks terrible, but at least at this point we are able to go through and be like, okay, maybe a value a little bit less crazily aggressive in here. And then we have just like knock it down to something a little bit more subtle than this, but just for the sake of, you know, I guess demonstration purposes. We have something that's like a very slight bump on our bump map. The other thing that's not a terrible thing to do is come through. You can set these values again, so if you do like a value of 0.5, no wait, sorry, if you set this to, nope. Why do I suddenly forget how to do this? Because that's a little annoying, honestly. What? So here's the thing, I actually usually don't map bump maps like this in Maya. I will usually just make bump maps in Photoshop. So it's a little weird. It seems to be actually registering the brightness of this. It seems like 0.18 is like right in the middle of the scale. So it's doing a weird thing where this is not true gray, or like true 50% gray. This is visually what appears to be medium gray. Which is obviously not ideal for this. So in this case, I would recommend sort of going through and swizzling some values until you find stuff, I guess, that kind of matches what you think you need. It's obviously a little bit annoying. Anyway, but that's a basic premise for adding like thumbprints and stuff to things. You could also, if you were going through, like for example, if this was glass, I don't know how well that's going to translate. It should do a pretty good job. Like, it's the same basic premise where, like, if you're adding, you know, thumbprints or something on, for me, normally I'll just do a roughness, if it's not metal, I'll just do a roughness map and a little bit of a bump map. If it's metal, you'd also need a little bit of a metalness map to, like, take down some of that shine a bit. But you can see it more or less transfers over. You could also go through and, like, if you didn't want this to be so rough, you could make that a little bit shinier, so that the thumbprints would end up being a little bit sort of rougher and standoffery. This is a very, very extreme example of a very over-aggressive thumbprint, but hopefully that gives you an idea of thumbprints. Did that help or make sense? Hopefully. Cool. Alright, cool. Thank you. Alright, so yeah, and then for dust, it's honestly kind of similar. It's just sort of deciding like how you want the dust to exist. So a lot of times it's more or less the same thing. You can do it procedurally, that's a CGI2 thing. But a lot of times it'll be just sort of going in and like focus on the major dust if you're looking at stuff. So like if there's, you know, maybe any like big hairs on stuff. But honestly, I think the fingerprints and the smudgies and stuff are probably going to be a little bit more realistic for things. Yeah, dust is weird. Anywho, all right. So I'm gonna pop back to the mix shader. All right, so we have this mix shader, and like I said, so you could do something custom with texture maps for this. And actually, since I now have a texture map, I'm gonna use the eyeball texture because that has some nice. You can use color textures for this. Just gonna convert them to grayscale. Don't forget to tick the Alpha's Luminance button. And this is actually kind of a weird example, apparently. So if we're looking at this, I actually have no idea on this where the eyeball texture is supposed to be. You can kind of see it back here, where it's like coming in a little bit chromy over here. It's actually not a fantastic example for that. I thought that would be more aggressive. You can see down here where like the black is like very clearly showing chrome. So you can import file textures. Again, for this assignment, if you want to do this, I would expect these file textures using for this mix weight here to be something that you custom made for your object specifically, rather than just a random eyeball texture from the internet. Alright, so the other thing you can do, and I just wanted to show you this for like ramps and stuff. Again, don't do this for this assignment, I just want you to be aware that you can do this. So you can use a ramp texture again. I'm really obsessed with ramp textures, in case that wasn't abundantly clear by now. So in this case, it'll just give you this, kind of weird looking. What you can do is throw in some noise into this, and it'll help to break up that texture a little bit, and probably actually would have made sense if I did this black and then this white. But basically the noise will just give you a little bit of like ripply texture in your stuff. And you can change the noise frequency a little bit, just kind of change like where stuff is laying on your model. So there's a lot of weird stuff you can do like this with ramp textures, which again can just be good. Mostly if you're doing like a generic ground texture kind of deal, you can do something like this to help break up the texture without having to like do it in Photoshop kind of thing. And then the other thing you could do is a noise texture, which I've actually wait, what am I doing? I used to be really into noise textures, and now I'm sort of not as much. I'm going to hit this little button up here. I don't circle with a isolate selected dashy line around it. Basically what that's going to do is show you only the thing that you currently have selected, which in this case is my noise texture. So there's some stuff you can do. I mean, I don't really use noise textures a lot, to be honest. The settings I feel like are pretty self-explanatory or like easy to figure out like once you're sort of like playing with the textures. There are different types of noise depending on what you want. Some of them are really weird. Wispy is usually pretty strange. But yeah, so I mean you could map this into a ramp texture, you could recolor it. It's just another way of getting what you want. I will say a lot of times that people will use they'll use noise textures on their stuff, and it'll look really bizarre. And it's very, like, Maya noise textures have a very distinct, I am a Maya noise texture vibe. So I don't usually recommend them, unless it's for something, like, in the very background of your scene, because they do oftentimes look a little bit silly. But they're good to know, at least, that they exist. So that's more or less the sort of file texture stuff that I wanted to go over. You can also do this with a sorry, what am I doing? Oh my god. So you can do this also if you want to with like glass. So if that chrome was glass, you can also do that very easily, and it's a good way of making like stickers on glass. It's just sort of like mapping transmission onto stuff. So if we have our mix real shader, super great naming conventions here. We can just pop that glass texture on, and you can see that now we're seeing through the background of this. So mix shaders are really handy. I honestly prefer mix shaders to doing stuff in Photoshop. So I figured you guys might be into that for this assignment. But yeah, so that was pretty much all the texturing stuff I wanted to go over. Does anybody have any questions about any of that or any texturing stuff before we hop over to something completely different? All right, cool. So in that case, if anyone has questions, again, I'm watching the chat. All right, so I promised you guys ugly neon signs, and I will deliver on these ugly neon signs if I can figure out where my orthographic view is. There we go. All right, so usually if I'm going to make a goofy sign, I am going to use a curve to do it, because I like my signs to look neon. So there is a fun tool called the pencil curve tool that basically do this in an orthographic view, or else it'll get really weird and distorted. But it'll allow you to basically draw that was supposed to say beans, and then I forgot how to make a cursive A. So here we are. But basically it'll allow you to draw a random curve. The downside of this is you can see there's a absolutely ridiculous number of control points in this, which is going to make things a little bit weird to modify later, and it can just be a little bit choppier than you want. So one thing you can do, I do recommend actually avoiding really sharp creases. Yeah, this is terrible cursive. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is just select that curve and go into the curves menu and rebuild. Pop up the settings for that. Most of these are probably fine as they are, but I'm going to do uniform build type, and this is the number of control vertices basically you want in your final curve. So what I'm going to do, I'll set this down to something really low, and basically what it's going to do is, like I said, it's going to add this many spans or control vertices evenly spaced throughout your object. So you do need to be careful that you don't, obliterate the detail in your stuff. So I'm going to set this up to maybe something like 28. That got worse. Maybe something a little bit less crazy. So you can see it smooths things a little bit. We have fewer curves. If I had to modify this, it's a little bit easier now. But yeah, so that's just a weird sort of fun thing. You can also use this if you want to rebuild or smooth your curves from cables from this week's assignment. Alright, so now we have this really, really poorly written neon sign wannabe. I'm just going to go ahead and make a random little curve here. Grab this and do a surfaces extrude on that. And since getting Maya, all of my settings for this have been reset, so that was a fun time. You can actually export this directly to polygons. I feel like usually when I do that, oftentimes it will try to tessellate it by default. So I undo this. Normally this is set to tries, in which case it'll give you... Okay, or not. Or it'll try to why will it not give me weird tries when I want weird tries? Anyway, you can export this directly to polys, so that's what I'm going to do here. Just make sure that you smooth that, or else it's going to look really, really crazy. Also, be aware that, sometimes if you are doing stuff with really extreme curves like I've done here, it will do some really nasty stuff and, flip your model inside out very aggressively. There is a fix for that. Sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes, going to curves rebuild and then rebuilding with more curves can sometimes help with that. This obviously makes it harder to edit because now you have 87 points in this, but at least it's not totally flipped inside out now. Basically what Maya does is also anytime it's trying to put in a edge loop for your polygon, it's going to map that with the control vertices. So the more control verts you have, the more information Maya has to not crush the ever-living crap out of your model. Alright, so that's basically a weird little curves bit that I wasn't really planning on doing. So, any questions on curves before I get into the actual lighting stuff? Alright. Excellent. So, what I'm going to do I'm just going to delete the history on this. I do edit, delete by type, delete by type history. I'm going to get rid of these NURBs. I don't really need them anymore. Alright, so there's two different ways to make a neon sign or to make something emissive or like seem like it's emitting light in Maya. The first is with an emissive texture, and that is what I will do on this one. So I'm going to go in, standard AI surface stator, like I always do. Pop open my delightful render view of Terror. Alright, wait for that to do something useful. Cool. Alright, so here we... What a fantastic scene. Something about that makes me very happy. Alright, so what I'm going to do in my surface shader is go down into the emission tab. And I think I mentioned this before, but I'm just going to turn emission all the way up. And I'm also going to just hide this area light to make things a little bit hard to see. So, quick, surface shader. So this is what it looked like without emission, with emission. So emission basically is fake, it's like glow, basically, on your object. It's not like a realistic light. This is not emitting light. It's cheating the appearance of emitting light. I really enjoy this. I think I might actually save this version of the file because it's stupid. So you can also change the color of this to be whatever you want. You can also set the weight to be something higher, like 10, which is going to be basically like very bright neon sign glow. So again, this is not actually emitting light, it's basically just fake emitting light. It's good, so emission is really nice for, like, if you have like a neon sign in the background, you don't need it, it's not something that's going to illuminate the entire space. You can totally just use a emission on stuff. Incidentally, it's also extremely good for, if you're making like an RGB keyboard for your final. Emission's really, really good for the letters. Because for emission, you can also make maps for, like, you can map anything into this. So you can have stuff be emissive or not emissive based on a file texture. So normally what you do is make basically a black and white image where your keyboard is black and then the letters or anything glowing would be white. Throw that into weight, you have instant glowing lighting. Alright, so this is emission. You can also put random stuff into the color, like a ramp texture. Mwahaha. And in the spirit of this being originally Halloween themed, I'm going to make this some kind of awful, awful Halloween colors. You will also notice the brighter you make this, the more distorted the colors are. Like, this is very clearly no longer orange, and that is more blue than green. So it can get a little bit weird the farther you go sort of towards the edges of the color spectrum. And then also certain colors will blend in the middle, like green and purple apparently make whitish. So that's a thing to be aware of. Set this back down to 1, see if that helps at all. So again, yeah, the brighter that gets, the more off your colors are going to look. So that's emission. Does anyone have any questions on that before we pop on to actual lights? Alright. I promised you actual... Oh, actually, sorry. There was one thing that I wanted to go over really quick. So if we look at... this is one of those instances where if you're making a neon sign, I do not give a flying fadoodle what your UVs look like. So a lot of times, to make a neon sign, I will straight up go in and just take the whole sign and just planar map the puppy. In this case, it didn't really change specifically like what was going on, but you can see we just have a nice sort of linear gradient there, and then it makes it very, very easy to delete history on that. If we want to go in and like recolor this, you know, you can set the U ramp instead of a V ramp. Are you actually rendering? What are you doing? Question mark. Okay, well, not really sure what the render settings are doing right now, but the viewport is being nice, so you can see it's like now the gradient's going in a different direction. It just makes it really easy to sort of recolor this, and since I'm not doing anything to this texturally, you know, like adding scratches or anything, I don't really care, because, again, like a background object, basically. Alright, so other thing is, like I said, making this actually a real light, which is going to be in the Arnold Lights tab. And basically just select your object and choose Mesh Light. It's going to go, there's a few things to be aware of with this. So, like I said, this is, by default, this is like an actual light casting actual real-world rays and sampling, and these are more computationally intensive. However, if you need your mesh light to emit actual light into your scene and not just fake glow on a wall, you are going to want to use a mesh light over emission. So let's pop up those. I was going for the render view. Never quite made it there somehow. Alright, so by default, this looks really stupid. You can see that, like, basically nothing's rendering. So one, I'm going to go ahead and set the exposure to something like 50. This is how I test that all my lights are working in the scene, incidentally. I also find it a lot easier, instead of taking the slider up, just set it to 50, and then you can really easily just, like, you know, take it back down to something that... yeah, sorry. To something that is a little bit more reasonable for the scene. Alright, so now we have this delightful, strange glow on the wall, but it's not doing anything. There's no visible light source casting this. What you can do is turn this light visible tick box on, and then you actually get that glowing light in there. You will, however, notice it looks really bad. Mesh lights, unfortunately, don't smooth with the 3 key. So that's the caveat of mesh lights, is you do actually just need to take that geometry and subdivide it. So that kind of sucks, honestly. There's not a great way around that. You can also, really quick, show the original mesh, which will cause some render issues here and there, because right now, I mean, for one, it's showing a lighting up object with an unlit object clipping through it. It gets a little weird. But what I'm going to do, I'll turn off light visible, and now we just have the object itself. What you can do is click on this, and if you mesh smooth this object, and just add subdivisions like you would hitting the 3 key, it should go through and also smooth your light. But do just be aware of that if you're like, why won't my light smooth? Mesh lights don't smooth. Which sucks. But anywho. Alright. So I'm going to go back into my light. I'll turn off the show original mesh really quick, and turn on light visible. Alright. And I'm going to refresh this, because I do not trust my render editor in the slightest. I have no faith in Maya. Okay, so we have this. What I'm going to do is use my Hypershade to pop in this exact same texture up here, so we have a closer representative sample. So pop into the Hypershade, and this is where I mentioned you might want to grab the textures up here. Textures. Alright, I'm going to grab this dude, and I'm going to chuck it in my color. Just middle mouse button, drag that in. Ooh, yes. Alright, and clearly the UVs on this are different than this, because that is not what we're getting down here. So what I'm going to do is just grab my my object and just do a planar map on that. It should then update the UVs. Alright. So, y'all with me so far? Alright. So, you can see, I mean, off the bat, you can see a few differences between this. So the actual light casting ability is maybe not terribly different. It will be really obvious though, like, so when I had this exposure set to 50, it blew out the entire scene. Oh god. Whereas if I have the emission, and I go and I tweak that and I set this, hello. Let's do something really weird, like 1,000. So 1,000 emission is not really, it's not like lighting up the scene. It makes a really overexposed part on the wall, but it's not like projecting light into the scene. So again, that's the first main difference. If you need this to throw light, you pretty much have to use a mesh light. The other thing that can get a little bit weird is, at some point, your light is going to start looking kind of gross. So like right now, if we have this set to exposure 1, it does absolutely nothing. The downside of mesh lights, if you're using mesh visible, is here at least you get, if you want this effect, you get a little bit of sort of like shading here around the edges where it kind of looks like maybe this could be encased in neon, kind of interesting like. Whereas mesh lights, you really don't get that. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll set up a mesh light to get, you know, whatever kind of lighting I want in my scene. That feels satisfyingly aggressive, but maybe it's going to take a little too long to render. So set up my mesh light, cool, that's fine, like it. I will turn off light visible, and sometimes I will go back in, and this is like where I said you might want to show that original mesh. What I can do is assign the probably AI standard surface 14. I don't know at this point. 15 is apparently the one that I'm actually looking for. Yes, good. Alright, so what I've done is I've actually assigned the emissive texture from the original object onto this mesh light. And what this will sort of allow you to do sometimes is like cheese a little bit more of the shadowing in. So obviously this is still emissive, this is still going to throw a shadow, basically, or like throw its own glow onto the wall, as well as the other objects around it. But usually it's kind of negligible, honestly. So you can use that to get a little bit more texture in here if you wanted this to feel less strangely flat, I guess. And that's actually pretty much usually what I do with mesh lights. That's more or less all I do with these. So again, mesh lights you probably won't need for your stuff. You might want to use emission for like the inside of LEDs, or other such things. Does anybody have any? There's two more things I want to say about mesh lights, but anyone have questions on that so far? All right. The other nice thing about doing the show object, or make object visible, is you can actually smooth it, so the object itself will render as smooth, just the light doesn't come off as smooth. So anywho, that's mesh lights. The only other thing is, again, they do take a long time to render if you make them like one of the primary illuminating sources of your scene. So what I do not recommend doing is something where, again, if you're trying to do, you know, like a light bulb in a ceiling or something like that, what you can do is cheese that with basically a slightly emissive piece of geometry that looks like a glowing bulb, and then just like throw an area light in front of it, kind of thing. That breaks down a little bit if you're like looking directly at the object. The other thing that you can do, so let's see. Actually, you know what, that's like hardcore weird environmental stuff, which you guys aren't doing, so never mind. But yeah, so just be aware that, again, these do take a long time to calculate rendering, because instead of throwing light from a single point, they're throwing light from like every single point on this surface outwards, and it's an absolute crap ton to do computationally. So just be aware of that. It's not a thing you want to just like casually throw into your scene, because it will really quickly mess with your render times. But yeah, that was mostly my bit on weird neon signs. I think the only other thing that I actually wanted to talk about, and somewhat annoyingly, it's not terribly obvious in this scene. I was actually actively hoping for some more sampling issues, which is not something I normally say. But let's take a look at this eyeball. I did just want to check again, just touch really quickly again on things that oftentimes will have like sampling issues and like how to fix them. So you can adjust sampling on a per light basis, which is basically going to be, so if you're, and actually this is usually a thing that I'll do for mesh lights, because mesh lights are always super grainy and terrible looking. Not always, but usually. You can, in each individual light, go in and up the number of samples here. So if you're having a mesh light and basically anything being shadowed by that mesh light is like kind of samply, the shadows look a little weird, up the samples in that specific light. You can see this taking a long time to render. Like if this was a normal light, this would have been done by now. So like I said, I mean this seems pretty much done. I'm getting like a lot of grain here. That's a thing for the individual light, because it's the light's fault. Mesh lights are really bad about this. So the other thing that you can do to sort of help sampling a little bit is going in and seeing maybe it's a particular thing in your object that's always having issues, or like a thing in your scene, or like an attribute. So this is really bad notoriously for transmission, which is going to be anything like glass like we have here, subsurface scattering, ouch, which I haven't really gone over, probably not really going to go over, as well as shiny stuff like metal, or if you just made something really, really shiny. And there are global render settings for that if you're noticing that all of these things universally throughout your scene are having trouble. So if you pop into your render settings and go to this little Arnold render tab, here we have all of the settings for global sampling levels. Camera AA is basically anti-aliasing. This is actually a bad example. If you set this down really low, it'll give you basically pixel art of your scene, which is kind of funny. By default, this is set to 3. Honestly, I'll usually leave it there. But we have, you can see, for each individual setting, I'm going to switch this back to my original because this mesh light is like impossible to do anything useful with. Show, okay. Yeah, see, mesh lights take a long time to render. Alright, so in this instance, you can see here that like this is like mostly done rendering in a lot of areas. Like this area just here just finished, and it's still pretty grainy. So in this case, I definitely need to go through and up my transmission samples. So again, my glass is having issues. I'm gonna have to like take those samples up a little bit. What I don't want to do is kind of the same thing I did for the subdivision, where you don't want to just set it to like 40 and be done with it, because that'll take forever to render. The goal of sampling is basically get the best quality image that you can with the fewest number of samples possible. And unfortunately, you know, every scene is different, every texture is different, like what you're texturing and stuff is all different, so I can't just like sit here and give you like some magical value that like if you use these sampling, your scenes are going to look super pretty. I mean, I can. It's up all of your samples and wait 30 hours for it to render, but that's a terrible idea. So it really is just sort of going through on a case-by-case basis and maybe being like, okay, maybe up this a little bit more. This clearly didn't do what I want. Up it a little bit more. See, just keep going through and like seeing if it's doing what you want. You can also, if you know, like I do not have subsurface scattering in this scene. I made all these textures. I didn't enable it. I know it's not there. Turn that all the way down. Same thing with volume indirect. I can turn that all the way down. And just sort of go through again and like mess with things like, so if this is a problem area, like target that area. Go in and be like, okay, maybe I need one more sample in here. Maybe I need 2. If you're not sure what you should be editing, what you can do is just target a very small area if you're going to do this. Just like turn this up really, really high and see if it fixes stuff. So in this case, like it pretty much is fixing stuff, so I know like that's probably the issue with my scene. And then just sort of, again, like once you know that that's the issue, you can sort of scale it back down until you have something that doesn't look terrible. So the other thing that I will also notice a lot of times will cause issues is specular. So this can be like anything glossy or shiny. So oftentimes I will need to set that up a little bit higher. In this case, I have just like some roughness kind of going on here, so I mean I could, you know, refine that a little bit more, but but mostly just going through and sort of looking at, again, like are there any areas that are like majorly sampling and kind of like paring that down. Get used to doing that for the final, because it is something that, again, you know, you shouldn't have like super samply renders for your final. The other thing you can do, which is kind of interesting, is turn the samples all the way off for like diffuse. And as you just sort of systematically turn off the sampling for stuff, you can kind of see like exactly what that's affecting. And at some point, it's like if you turn off transmission, anything with glass in it basically just goes totally black and it looks really strange. Interestingly enough, like diffuse should, I think my render view needs to be refreshed again. But fascinating. That pretty much always will break stuff if I turn diffuse off entirely. That's kind of annoying that it's not. But it is kind of interesting. Like sometimes I will actually turn all my settings off entirely and then just like slowly take them up. Because I've actually found, like once or twice, I've actually found that like I didn't really need, I needed like 1 sample for stuff and it was fine. And that's still way less samples than 2 by the time you know, take a sample or 2 or 3 per pixel. So anywho, I mean that's more so my weird bit on rendering. You will know, I mean at some point you will notice that like your renders will break down. If you turn certain things off far enough down, it'll sort of not render correctly and it'll just be like totally black. So that's just like a weird thing to be aware of. But that's basically my weird bit on sampling and pretty much the last thing I had to go over. So before I let you guys go, does anybody have any questions or anything else they want to go over? All right. In that case, go forth, be free. I'm going to upload these videos to YouTube, and then I will link them in the class video section in the week assignment folder. Sorry. Yes, also that. good reminder. Do remember crit. But yeah, so I mean that's basically, like I said, everything I wanted to go over. So I'm just gonna let you guys go instead of rambling like a crazy person at you guys. That's what happens when I talk for 6 hours straight.